The island looks like a postcard from paradise. Too perfect, too still. The ocean surrounding it is flat, like a sheet of blue glass, devoid of waves or even a whisper of fog. 4 sailors, Captain Miller, Elias the navigator, Sarah the engineer, and young Jax, stumble onto the white sand, expecting the usual sounds of a tropical shore. But there is no rustle of palm leaves, no cry of gulls. There is only a silence so absolute it feels heavy. Elias pulls out his heirloom mechanical watch to check their position. He gasps as the metal casing begins to hum. The gears inside are vibrating with such violent intensity that the sapphire glass suddenly spiderwebs and shatters. He looks up at the sun. It sits directly at high noon. It has stayed in that exact spot, burning with a frozen intensity for the last 6 hours. The shadows haven't crawled an inch. The true horror hits when Captain Miller accidentally slices his palm on a jagged piece of rusted metal from an old shipwreck. He winces, waiting for the familiar sting and the flow of dark red blood. But nothing happens. The blood sits frozen inside the gash like tiny, jagged red crystals. There is no pain, no warmth, and the wound refuses to either bleed or close. It is a biological snapshot, stuck in the moment of impact. Time is the heartbeat of the universe. But on this island, the heart has stopped. There is no before, and there is no after. There is only a permanent, suffocating now. They landed here thinking they found a shortcut through the doldrums. They didn't realize that on this island, a single second can last for an eternity. How do you escape a place where the exit hasn't happened yet? To get home, they have to restart the world's clock, and the battery requires a life. The crew of the SS Odyssey was composed of people who lived by the clock. Captain Miller obsessed over deadlines. Elias navigated by the precise rotation of the stars. Sarah maintained engines that ran on time cycles. But their world shattered when they hit the white squall. A freak meteorological event that didn't just toss the ship, but seemed to bleach the very data from their digital logs. When the mist cleared, they weren't in the Atlantic anymore. They were drifting toward the island of broken clocks, a place where the horizon looked like a painted backdrop and the air felt as thick as set gelatin. The first sign of the island's sickness came from the engine room. Sarah, a woman who could fix anything with a wrench and a bit of grit, found herself defeated by physics. She tried to spark the ignition, but the engine wouldn't roar. She watched the spark plug through the maintenance hatch. A tiny, brilliant blue flash of electricity appeared, but it didn't dissipate. It just stayed there, a frozen spark in a chamber of dead fuel. Fire is a chemical reaction, a process of oxidation that requires time to progress from 1 millisecond to the next. On this island, the reaction couldn't travel. The energy was present, but the flow was gone. The spark happened, but the flame refused to grow. Stepping off the ship was like walking into a high-definition photograph. They called it the static forest. It was a lush, emerald jungle, but it was devoid of the one thing that defines nature: movement. A tropical gale was clearly blowing, yet the palm leaves didn't rustle. They were locked in jagged, slanted positions, hard as steel to the touch. The waves at the shoreline were the most unsettling. They didn't crash. They were frozen mid-curl, crystalline sculptures of salt water that looked like shards of broken glass. If you ran your hand along the crest of a wave, it didn't splash. It cut your skin like a diamond blade. The island was a masterpiece of stillness, a world where the wind was a solid wall and the ocean was a frozen monument. Driven by a desperate need for human contact, the crew pushed inland until they stumbled upon a village nestled in a clearing. At first, Miller thought it was a wax museum. The streets were populated with people in local dress, but no one was moving. It was a carnival of paused lives. A woman was standing by a well, her mouth open in a mid-morning laugh, a bucket of water suspended in the air with the droplets hanging like a string of pearls. A child was caught mid-fall, leaning at a 45-degree angle toward the dirt, his face twisted in the beginning of a cry that would never be heard. There was no rot, no smell of death, only the suffocating scent of ozone and old dust. Jax, the youngest of the group, couldn't help himself. He was drawn to the child. "Are they statues?" he whispered, his voice sounding thin in the vibrationless air. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the villager's cheek. The skin was warm, unnervingly warm. As Jax's skin made contact with the villager's, the air seemed to groan. Then it happened. The villager's eyes, which had been fixed on the horizon for what might have been centuries, began to move. It was a slow, agonizingly painful crawl, a frame-by-frame shift that took nearly a minute. The pupils dilated with a terrifying, silent scream. The villagers weren't dead. They were fully conscious, trapped in the amber of a single millisecond, watching the world remain still while their minds raced at full speed. The realization that they were trapped in a physical stalemate didn't hit them with a bang, but with a hollow, gnawing ache. By the end of the first day, though the sun hadn't moved an inch, the crew began to experience the phantom hunger. Jax tried to swallow a piece of hardtack, but his throat wouldn't work. The muscles responsible for peristalsis, the rhythmic wave that moves food through the body, were paralyzed by the island's stasis. Digestion is a process governed by the clock, a series of chemical breakdowns that require time to progress. On this island, the food just sat on their tongues, dry and tasteless. Their brains were screaming for calories, triggering the physical agony of starvation, but their bodies remained perfectly preserved in the state they were in when they stepped off the boat. The psychological toll was even more devastating. As the hours stretched into what felt like weeks, the sailors realized they were denied the one thing the human mind needs to survive: sleep. To fall asleep is to transition from one neurological state to another, a journey into REM cycles that requires the brain to flow. Here, the transition was impossible. They were locked in a 24/7 waking nightmare, their nervous systems firing with the exhaustion of a marathon runner, but with no way to shut down. The silence of the island began to roar in their ears. Without the before of a thought or the after of a memory, their personalities began to fracture like dry glass. Sarah, whose mind was built on the logic of gears and levers, refused to break. She followed the hum of the vibrating air until they reached the center of the island. There, rising like a jagged needle of obsidian, was the Kronos anchor. It was a massive, ancient machine, covered in shifting geometric carvings that seemed to move only when you weren't looking. Sarah brushed away the vines and realized this wasn't an altar, it was a stabilizer. It was designed to pin the fabric of space-time to a single coordinate, an ancient safety valve, meant to stop time to prevent a past disaster from ever completing its path. The island was a wound that had been cauterized, held in a state of permanent now, to keep then from happening. As the gravity of their situation set in, the crew began to turn on each other. Elias, the navigator who had spent his life fearing the end of his career and the frailty of his aging body, looked at his hands. They were steady. His skin was smooth. "Don't you see?" he whispered, his eyes wide with a manic light. "If time doesn't move, we are gods. We are immortal. No disease, no aging, no death. We can live in this perfect noon forever." But Captain Miller, looking at the paused villagers whose eyes were still screaming, gripped Elias by the collar. He knew the truth. Forever without change isn't life, it's a tomb. It's the ultimate sensory deprivation chamber. They reached the base of the tower and Jack stumbled over something metallic. He looked down and gasped. Piled around the obsidian base were thousands of broken watches, pocket watches, digital Casios, ancient sundials, all vibrating in a discordant chorus of ticking. Miller knelt and picked up a heavy gold chronometer. His breath hitched. Engraved on the back were the initials EM, Edward Miller. This was his father's watch, the man who had vanished in these waters 30 years ago. Miller looked at the face of the watch and felt his blood turn to ice. It was the only thing on the island that was moving. The hands were spinning with a blurring, frantic speed, but they were ticking backward. The closer they drew to the obsidian needle of the Kronos anchor, the more reality began to fray at the edges. It started with the time echoes, shimmering, translucent distortions in the air that looked like film reels overlapping. These weren't ghosts, they were possible versions of the crew. Miller saw himself screaming at a wall that wasn't there. Sarah saw herself dismantling a gear that was still 10 feet away. These gray, blurry shadows were performing actions they hadn't committed yet, a terrifying preview of a future that was trying to force its way into the stagnant present. The island was no longer just still, it was crowded with the ghosts of the next 5 minutes. Jax was the first to see his own fate. He looked up at the spiraling stairs of the tower and saw an echo of himself slumped against the stone, his chest caved in. The echo's eyes were glassy and fixed. Jax tried to turn back to run toward the beach, but the island's geometry had become a trap. Every path he took, every turn, every sprint, looped him back to the base of those stairs. In a world where time doesn't flow, space becomes a circle. He was being funneled toward his own death by a landscape that refused to let him deviate from the snapshot it had already taken. The tower was not undefended. Emerging from the shadows of the obsidian pillars were the guardians of the pause. These weren't biological beings. They were horrific amalgams of rusted brass gears, jagged clock hands, and ivory pendulum weights, all held together by a humming electromagnetic force. They moved with a stuttering, terrifying logic. They only progressed when the survivors blinked. Every time Miller or Sarah closed their eyes for a millisecond, the Guardians would lurch 5 feet closer, their rusted blades positioned to strike. To survive, the crew had to endure the agony of keeping their eyes wide, their corneas drying out in the moistureless air, watching the metal monsters inching toward their throats. Elias, still consumed by the delusion of immortality, turned on the group. He grabbed a heavy brass gear from a Guardian's remains and swung it at Miller. "I won't let you kill us," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I want to stay. I want to live forever." In his manic frenzy, he backed away from Miller's counterattack and stumbled into a time pocket. A localized distortion where the Chronos anchor was leaking concentrated temporal energy. Inside that small, shimmering bubble, time wasn't frozen. It was accelerating at 1,000 times its normal speed. The transition was instantaneous and horrific. One moment, Elias was a middle-aged man with a look of defiance. The next, his skin turned a deep, leathery gray, then sagged and dissolved into dust. His hair grew to his waist and turned white before falling out in clumps. His eyes clouded over and sank into his skull. Because the air inside the pocket was moving so fast, his scream was pitched up into a frequency the human ear couldn't even register. In a flash that lasted less than a heartbeat to the observers, Elias withered, dried, and turned into a bleached skeleton. Then came the final, physics-defying insult. As Elias's skeletal remains fell out of the high-speed pocket and hit the paused air of the island, they didn't crash to the ground. The bones hit the static atmosphere and stopped. They hung in the air, suspended in the thick, unmoving oxygen like a morbid mobile. Ribs, vertebrae, and the skull floated at eye level, frozen in the middle of a tumble. The island wouldn't even grant him the dignity of a fall. Elias had wanted to stay on the island forever, and now he would, as a floating monument of bone, stuck in the very air he had fought to keep still. The summit of the obsidian tower was not a room, but a cavernous void where the laws of physics seemed to dissolve. Suspended from a ceiling of rotating brass rings was the great pendulum, a massive emerald-encrusted weight the size of a ship's hull. It hung perfectly still, paralyzed at the highest point of its arc. Holding it in place was a spear of solidified silence, a translucent, shimmering spike that looked like frozen light. This was the break of the world. As long as that spear held the pendulum, the island, and perhaps the entire region, was pinned to a single, unmoving moment. Sarah, her engineer's mind racing despite the exhaustion, ran her hands over the base of the mechanism. She looked at the ancient inscriptions and the way the gears were aligned with the celestial poles. Her face went pale. "It's a closed loop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "To restart the clock, we have to shatter the spear and push the pendulum. But the friction, it's not just physical. It's temporal." She explained the horrific cost. The act of restarting time would release a surge of chronal radiation so intense that the person pushing the weight would be erased. They wouldn't just die, their entire timeline would be unraveled. Their parents would never have met. Their name would vanish from every ledger. They would be a hole in the fabric of the universe. The moral weight in the room became heavier than the obsidian walls. Captain Miller looked at Jax, who was barely 20, a boy whose life was still a blank map. He looked at Sarah, a brilliant mind with a husband and a daughter waiting for her in London. Miller then looked at his own hands, the hands of a man who had spent 40 years chasing horizons, only to find a pile of broken watches and a father who had become a ghost. He realized he was the only one whose life was already a circle. Below them, the tower began to groan. The guardians of the pause had reached the upper chambers. Their rusted, serrated limbs were screeching against the stone, a sound like 1,000 knives sharpening at once. Outside, a more terrifying sound began. The paused villagers were finally starting to move as the static barrier began to fracture. Because their minds had been conscious for centuries while their bodies were frozen, their first act of life was a collective, soul-shattering scream of agony. The island was waking up, and it was waking up insane. "Do it now," Sarah screamed, pointing to the spear. "If we wait, the Guardians will kill us all and keep the clock stopped forever." Miller didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the great pendulum, his boots crunching on the dust of millennia. He wrapped his arms around the cold, emerald surface. He looked back at Sarah and Jax, his eyes softening for the first time since they had left the Odyssey. "Tell them we were here," he said, his voice a low growl of resolve. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't just tears of grief, they were tears of terror. "Tell who, Captain?" she cried out, her voice breaking. "If you do this, the universe will rewrite itself. There will be no record of your birth, no memory of your face. I won't even remember your name. To me, we'll have just survived. You'll be nothing." Miller didn't flinch. He put his shoulder against the weight, the solidified silence beginning to crackle and spark with a violent, violet energy. He gave one final, defiant smile. Then at least someone gets to live to forget me. Miller threw the entire weight of his existence against the emerald mass. For a heartbeat, the universe resisted. Then, with a sound like a lightning bolt striking a cathedral, the spear of solidified silence shattered into a million sparkling shards. The great pendulum swung. A massive, bone-shaking tick erupted from the tower, a sound so profound it felt like the heartbeat of a god. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The now was obliterated by the next. Outside, the sun didn't just move, it plummeted toward the horizon in a blur of orange and violet. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, tearing through the jungle with centuries of pent-up kinetic energy. The frozen glass waves finally collapsed, crashing against the shore with a roar that shook the island's foundations. But the most horrific sight was the village. As time caught up to the paused inhabitants, their biological clocks accelerated to match their chronological age. In a single second, hundreds of people turned gray, withered, and crumbled into fine white dust. They didn't die in that moment, they had been dead for centuries. The island had simply forgotten to let them fall. Sarah and Jax didn't stay to watch the world age. They sprinted down the spiraling stairs, their feet finally moving in a fluid, rhythmic motion. They reached the SS Odyssey just as the tide rushed back in, no longer a canyon but a churning, rising sea. Sarah dived into the engine room and turned the key. This time the spark didn't just hang in the air, it ignited. The fuel exploded in the cylinders, and the engine roared to life with a beautiful, mechanical fury. They pushed the throttle to the wall, sailing away as the island began to sink, not into the water but into the past. The obsidian tower flickered like a dying light bulb and then vanished, leaving only an empty, fog-heavy ocean behind. Days later, a Navy destroyer intercepted their drifting vessel. Sarah and Jax were physically unharmed, but they were hollow. As they sat in the ship's infirmary, a medical officer asked for their manifest. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. "There were 4 of us," she whispered, her brow furrowing in deep, agonizing confusion. She looked at Jax, who was staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. They both felt a void, a cold, jagged hole in their memories where a person should be. They knew someone had saved them. They knew someone had pushed the pendulum. But they couldn't remember a face, a voice, or a name. Captain Miller had been effectively scrubbed from the tapestry of the universe. The final blow came when Sarah was being discharged. She reached into her damp coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled, salt-stained photograph taken before the white squall. It was a picture of the crew standing on the deck of the Odyssey. In the center of the photo, between her and Jax, was a blurry, glowing white space, a human-shaped gap where the light seemed to have been erased. She flipped the photo over. In her own handwriting, written in a frantic scrawl that she didn't remember penning, were the words, "Don't forget the man who gave us tomorrow." She stared at the ink, a single tear carving a path through the salt on her cheek, mourning a man she no longer knew. Time has returned, but it kept the memory of a hero as its tax. The island has vanished into the folds of history, but sometimes when Sarah looks at a mechanical clock, she sees the second hand skip a beat, a tiny rhythmic hesitation as if someone is still there, deep in the machinery, pushing the pendulum to keep the world moving. If you were offered a choice, to live forever in one perfect, frozen moment, or to vanish completely so that the world could have its next second, which would you choose?